Hello there! In this video I want to talk about the music critics' response to jazz fusion and to some extent prog, but I think in this video we're really going to talk about jazz fusion. It's something that's really bothered me all my life and I didn't quite get as a kid. As an aspiring musician, I really got swept up in with bands like Led Zeppelin and Deep Purple and Black Sabbath and Jimi Hendrix and The Doors, and to me it seemed quite obvious that rock and roll was an incredible thing. It was a way in for musicians, you know, to express themselves that weren't necessarily classically trained. You know, it was a visceral thing, and that's what got me into music. You know, the first band I ever liked was Motorhead and probably AC/DC. Wasn't complex music, but it got you right there, and that's rock and roll. But rock and roll starts to develop, and in the 60s, bands like the Beatles and the Stones and the Doors, you know, they start to expand on the vocabulary of rock music. They start to get it to do other things that, you know, rock and roll couldn't do. So rock and roll's all about, you know, having a good time, driving around in cars, picking up girls, you know, blah, blah, blah. It's all that type of thing. It's all very youthful and teenage. Then Bob Dylan comes out, and Bob Dylan, you know, really changes what you can do within rock music and expands out. And people don't realise that someone like Bob Dylan gave someone like Frank Zappa the permission to do the stuff he did, right? So I see rock and roll and rock music as being this incredibly expansive, open thing where you can do all sorts of things. So it's not surprising that the sponge that it is, it starts to pull in folk music, and it starts to pull in, you know, classical influences and Latin influences with like bands like Santana, and jazz. You know, jazz is right there from the start with rock music. Jazz, you know, in rhythm and blues and jazz and the blues, all those things are the same thing. All right. So jazz musicians, you know, the open ones, are going to take on rock as an idea. You know, and it starts to happen in the mid-60s, late 60s. They don't get it right straight off. But, you know, people like Mike Knock and Larry Coryell, Steve Marcus, Gary Burton, all these people are really pushing at the boundaries of what jazz can do. And then they start to work out ways that can do it. And I think it's because the rock guys have worked ways to do it. You know, I think Jimi Hendrix is there with a band of gypsies and, you know, the Electric Ladyland album, finding ways of expressing yourself at a high level improvisatory, which jazz musicians can latch onto. So you see this thing going across. You know, you see Miles and Coltrane playing modally. You see them like the Byrds trying to play like Coltrane on 500 Miles High, and then you see people like Miles Davis listening to the Byrds and then taking it back into jazz. But from my point of view, discovering all this stuff and discovering albums that were changing me completely, you know, bands like the Mavish Orchestra, Weather Report, Miles Davis, Larry Coryell, you know, all the sort of Gil Scott Herons, all that type of thing that I could hear the jazz influence, Earth, Wind and Fire, you know, and then Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin with their improvising going on, you know. And bands like Hawkwind and Gong and all this stuff that was going on, you know, I wanted to know more about it. So I toddled down to the library and I got books out on, you know, the history of rock and roll. And I got books, have I got one here that I can pull out? I may have. I picked up I picked up, no, I can't find anything here. Let's have a look over here. There we go. Here's a book from my childhood. Right? This is the Rolling Stone album guide. Right? And this is what I use to be able to find out albums. So I've just clicked through. Right? And there is the Mavish Orchestra. Right? So I've just posted up a video on about my favourite drummers, and Narada Michael Walden's come out, Vision with Emerald Beyond has come out #1. On my list of favourite Mavish albums, I think that came out #1 or #2. It came up pretty high. So, look in the Mavish Orchestra. They've given the first album 4 stars, Birds of Fire 4 stars, Between Nothing and Eternity, 3 stars. And then Apocalypse, 2 stars. Visions of the Emerald Beyond, 2 stars, right? Really, you know, and what have they got to say about this? Not long after the orchestral debacle called Apocalypse Gulp, McGofflin briefly retreated from electric music and recorded an acoustic album with Indian musicians. Right? That's all they've got to say about those albums. They don't even mention why they've only given Visions of the Emerald Beyond 2 stars. But they call Apocalypse, one of the greatest albums ever made, an orchestral debacle. Right? This is always the case, right, with fusion. As soon as you get a book, any critic talking about it, they are sniffy and they start turning up their nose at it. And that's really the thing I want to talk about. I'm hoping on the beginning of this video, I've given an argument for why these albums should be seen in the same canon as your Sgt. Pepper's. They're doing something else. You see, the future albums are doing something else. They're dealing with music, right? Some music is advanced because it's dealing with lyrics, like Bob Dylan, Leonard Cohen. That's about lyrics, about content. It's about what the tracks are about. And that's really important. And rock and roll changed that. He was able to change that because of things like country music and the blues, where they really changed the subject matter, you know. But also, the music's changing as well. And people like Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles are changing what could be rock and roll and what's included as rock and roll. And if you wanted to go to the albums, the equivalent of the Bob Dylans, an equivalent to your Leonard Cohens, an equivalent, you know, to your Joni Mitchells. Now I say Joni Mitchell because Joni Mitchell will have really high in that book there will have loads of millions of stars because the lyrics are really strong, but also musically it's really strong and she's pulling from jazz. So if you want to know what's going on with jazz, if you want to know what's going on in music and rock and roll, you need to go to some of these fusion albums. They have pioneered what's going to happen in rock music all the way through. They're the pressure cooker, right? So why don't the critics value that? Well, I think the answer's right there in front of you. Music critics deal with words, right? They understand words and they can talk about words. Right? In most cases, they don't really know about music. That's the first thing. The second thing is a music critic always wants to make themselves look clever. And they never like music that makes them feel less clever. Their gut reaction is to criticize it. Right? They criticize what they don't understand. They don't like musicians that are in a position above them. Right? They like to be able to point and go, I think that this person is brilliant because I can see the wonder and amazement in it. And because they know about words, they are able to point, you know, at a Bob Dylan and go, oh, isn't this brilliant? The literary illusions, blah, 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 and see all that. But they're not able to see it with music. They never have been able to, ever. And this goes all the way through music criticism. It's one of the reasons why prog doesn't get valued. There are also other issues yet there of certain styles of music being valued, you know, when you bring those influences in. And jazz is troublesome, you know. For a lot of people, they don't understand bebop jazz, they don't understand free jazz, they don't understand modal jazz, right? They for most people, they'll see a lot more worth in the swing era jazz or Louis Armstrong, which are incredible music, you know. But I think the influences coming from, you know, more avant-garde jazz into rock music, they just don't understand and they don't know about it. So there's that reaction. But there's something else that needs to be mentioned. There's the jazz criticism as well. So the jazz critics, you know, are an incredibly snobby lot. And they really see the worth of jazz as linked in to a sort of suffering artist, you know, narrative. You know, this is also linked into the story of, you know, Afro-American sort of story, which I feel often tries to make out that these musicians like Louis Armstrong, Sidney Bechet and all these are sort of, how can you put it, innate geniuses. They didn't know what they were doing, and that's not the case, you know. Charlie Parker, Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Sidney Bechet. They're some of the most sophisticated musicians that ever lived, that knew everything about music, right? This is not the case. But there's this, that narrative is in there, and a narrative of authenticity. And so the critics will see proper straight jazz as being more real than anything that's a fusion. Not understanding that jazz is a fusion right from day one. That the blues is a fusion right from day one. Okay? You know, the first blues is urban blues. It's not Robert Johnson with an acoustic guitar, this itinerant guy that doesn't know what he's doing, travelling from town to town, that we've discovered, that the elite have discovered and been able to present. And this really was going on. People like John Hammond and Alan Lomax were brilliant, you know, really important, you know, but it was an elite discovering them and pushing them forward and saying, look at this, I've discovered this here. This is what music critics do. I have discovered this thing, you know? So if you've built up a belief about jazz, that's where the worth is, right? When jazz musicians start pulling on popular music, right, they see that as a somehow diminishing. And it proves that they do not know what they were talking about, because jazz has done that from day one, right? When the bebop musicians are playing How High the Moon, they're playing a pop tune and they're transforming it. Jazz has always been linked in directly to popular music, right? Jazz created popular music. It is popular music, right? But it's more than popular music, and it goes off, and like a nuclear reactor, it creates new forms and pulls new things in, right? And the critics, they love it when Louis Armstrong's doing it. They love it when Louis Armstrong's pulling country music and blues, and he's pulling in ragtime and classical music. They love that, you know, because Louis is this sort of innate genius that doesn't really know what he's doing, you know. But for a modern jazz musician to do that, no, we don't like it. And that is one of the things, I think, those two things together, that the rock critics are more impressed with the literary side of things and don't understand the music side. And the jazz critics do understand the music side, but they have a snobbery about anything coming in from the outside and sort of spoiling it, you know. So if you start using hip-hop influences or drum and bass influences, you've somehow diminished the purity of it, you know. And this really goes back to almost like a Rousseau noble savage narrative, you know, that I find a bit dodgy, to be honest. And those two things mean from both quarters. The jazz guys don't like the fusion and the rock guys don't understand the fusion, you know, and it makes nobody look any good. And I think that's one of the reasons why these albums haven't been valued as much as they should. They're not held up as going, oh my God, you know, the Mahavishnu Orchestra albums are some of the most important albums, change the face of music. You don't get that narrative, right? With the advent of the internet and a more democratization of this, you know, people like me being able to get up and have my say, I think things have changed. Also, there's a generation that have come up that have actually are influenced by that and are pointing to it and going, no, we love that, you know. Also, I think hip hop, which is the rock critics, you know, the pop critics value, obviously is built upon samples from jazz fusion. So that's made, you know, the going back and searching out these old fusion albums and finding out the treasures that are on there has also elevated that. So I think this has changed recently, and this music is getting valued more and more, which is very, very important. But we should, and it's the reason why I do this these videos, is just to try and draw attention to some albums that really changed my life, right? And I've played all sorts of music, not jazz fusion. I played rock, folk, reggae, funk, you know, prog, and those influences are there in me. And I think that's really important to celebrate. So I hope you are all celebrating it with me. I hope you enjoy this video. If you like this and you like this sort of like more ranty side where I get into certain things, I will do that more. I'm good at ranting. I will do that more. So if you want that, you know, put it in the comments. You know, like and subscribe, you know, keep in touch, and let's keep the conversation up, you know, and let's celebrate brilliant music. Thank you very much.